disk management and maintenance. In this nugget, we're going to talk about working with the disks and drives on your Mac. We'll talk about how to view them, obviously, but we'll also talk about how to format them, do things like work with RAID arrays, do check disks to make sure that the disk is valid and repair it. We'll talk about defragmentation, and then we're also going to talk about managing and working with disk image files, including ISO files, which are a CD or a DVD image file. So let's start with some basic disk management tasks. As you can see, I've connected a USB portable external drive to my computer that has a volume name of portable, and I've got my internal Macintosh hard drive also. Renaming a drive is really easy. Just click on it once to select it, and then click on it again slightly slower, and it'll go into rename mode. So I can type a new name. We'll call this USB, and then that's the new volume name. Now, the majority of your disk management tasks are going to take place inside of the utility called Disk Utility. The easiest way to get to that is probably, or at least the easiest way to remember, is to open up a new Finder window, go to your Applications folder, and then within there, scroll down until you find the Utilities folder, and there you'll find Disk Utility. Now, there's another way to get there too. If you're in Finder and its menu is active, you can go to the Go menu, and it's got several presets, and one of them is Utilities. You can see that there's also a Shift-Command-U keyboard shortcut that will take you directly to the Utilities folder. So once we're in there, let's just find the disk utility, double-click it to run it, and there we go. So what we've sort of got in here are all the different hard drives, and that's this top-level element. And within each hard drive, we can have one or more volumes or partitions. So let's take a look at my built-in hard drive as an example. We can see that on the partition tab, the majority of the space is being used by a volume or partition called Macintosh hard drive. I can erase this entire drive. I can restore it, which is the act of copying a disk image from externally somewhere else onto this disk. And there are some first aid functions. If there's problems, I can click repair, and the operating system will attempt to do some fixes. This is very similar to the check disk function in Windows. It'll attempt to go find any bad blocks on the drive, mark them as off limits, and so forth. If you click on a volume, really the only thing that changes is you lose the partition tab up here. A volume is a partition, so you can't create more partitions within it. So when you're at this lower level area. So this is kind of just a convenient way. You're probably not going to spend a lot of time in here. And if you've got a larger Mac and it's got more than one drive, you can configure a redundant array of inexpensive disks or a RAID set. You can mirror two drives. You can stripe or concatenate 3 or more drives. And really all you do to do this, if you've got multiple drives, is just drag the disks or volumes that you want to participate in the set into this box down here. And then you can configure your options for block size, automatically rebuild mirror sets, and so forth. That's something that you typically don't see a lot of people doing on Mac laptops, especially since they only have one drive, or even on Mac desktops, although you will run into that feature a little bit more if you're working with a Mac server. Now, one thing you're not seeing on here is any way to defragment the disk. And I'm just going to go ahead and close the disk utility here. Right-click one of my volumes, just to point out that you're not going to see defragment here either. Even if I go to more, you're not seeing any kind of defragmentation at all. Now, Apple will tell you that Mac automatically defragments its hard drive as it goes. And Microsoft will tell you the same thing about Windows. And to a degree, they're both correct, but to a large degree, they're both lying, unfortunately. Mac hard drives can get just as defragmented as a Windows hard drive. The only trick is that Apple does not make a defragmentation utility to go through and defragment that. So instead, you'll have to get one for yourself. Most of these are going to cost you a little bit of money. Here's one that I found and I use and I like. It's called iDefrag. It's $30, and it's the standard type of thing. You get this little block display, and it'll defragment the drive. And let me just sort of quickly describe the idea behind fragmentation in case it's a concept you haven't run into before. As you add new files to your hard drive, they all start to get stacked up in order. If you can imagine a suitcase, When you put clothes in, you start on the bottom and you gradually fill the suitcase in from the top. Now imagine for a minute that you're packing your suitcase in the space shuttle in orbit around the Earth. So when you take clothes out of the middle of the suitcase, the ones above it just kind of continue floating there. So you've got this little space floating around in the middle of the suitcase. Well, that's what happens when you delete files from your hard drive. You'll leave this space in the middle where the file used to be. And when you go to add another file to the hard drive, the operating system will attempt to reuse all of that empty space in the middle. So let's say that your suitcase had a bunch of shirts, and you took 2 shirts out of the middle. So now there's space for 2 shirts. Only now, instead of adding another couple of shirts to the suitcase, you're going to add a winter coat. And the winter coat's not going to fit in the space that was formerly occupied by 2 shirts. And so what happens is, at least on the disk, this sounds unfortunate for your clothing, but it's what happens. The operating system is going to put half of your winter jacket into the empty space that's available, and then cut the rest of the winter jacket and move it to the top of the suitcase. In other words, the operating system will attempt to fill in all the little empty bits left by missing files, even if that means breaking your new file up into multiple different chunks. Now that's not as bad as it sounds. A sliced up winter jacket isn't very useful, but a file that's been sliced up is still perfectly good. The operating system knows that this file has been spread across the disk, and it knows how to go get all the little bits and put them back together and make them useful. The problem is it takes time. If you had to dig through your suitcase to find all 8 pieces of your winter jacket, that's going to be a lot slower than if you could just go to one spot and have your winter jacket all there. So the process of defragmentation is taking all the files that have been sliced up and spread across the disk and putting them back together into single chunks of contiguous space so that the entire file is located in one spot. A disk drive that's a little bit defragmented isn't a big deal. A disk drive that's really defragmented, say from a 5-year-old computer that's in constant use and has never been defragmented, well, the fragmentation really can slow it down. And the moral of the story is you're going to have to go get a third-party utility to do that defragmentation on a Mac. So the next thing I want to do, now that we've kind of talked about disks and all that, is talk a little bit about disk images. Now the way to work with disk images is to go back to the utilities folder. So let's get Finder up and running here. And applications, and let's go down to utilities and find disk utility. So I am going to create a new file, new blank disk image. And let's just say that I'm going to put some documents in this, so I'm just going to call it docs. I'm going to store it on the desktop, and I'm going to make it a 10 megabyte image because I don't plan to put very much stuff in it. I can choose to use encryption or not. Typically you don't do a partition map in these things. It's just a file, and I'll click Create. Okay, so let me minimize disk utility and show you what's on the desktop now. Here's that file, docs.dmg. That is a disk img DMG file. You'll see folks call this a damage file or something like that, but it's a disk image. Double-clicking a DMG file mounts it, makes it look like a disk drive, and that's what you're seeing here, disk image. So I can rename the actual drive that this appears as. I can right-click it, I can get properties, I can apply a label to it. I can really treat it just like I would treat any disk. We'll call this My Docs. And I can go into my hard drive, find some files that I want to put on there, like the list, and copy those over to that disk image. Notice that the disk image shows up in my list of devices over here. It looks for all intents and purposes like it's a USB hard drive that's been attached to the system. When I'm finished using it, when I'm finished copying files to and from it, I need to eject it. There's a couple of ways. I can drag it down, and you'll notice that the trash can actually turned into an eject icon. Another option would be to right-click it and eject it. And a third option would be to come over here into Finder, find it, and click the little eject button that's next to it. So that unmounts the image. The image is no longer visible as a drive, but it is still available as a file. You can kind of think of this file as a zip file. Now there's not actually compression going in, but it's one file that sort of bundles up everything that's been placed into that image. This is how most Macintosh applications are distributed on the internet. Folks will take all the files that go with the application, copy them onto a DMG, create a disk image, and then they might right-click that and compress the DMG file itself. So I've right-clicked that and created a zip file that's hopefully a little bit smaller. We can find out by going into Finder, looking at my desktop. The original DMG file was 10 megabytes because that's the size I created it as. Even though there's not 10 megabytes worth of files, it's still going to take up 10 megabytes worth of space. Most of that will be empty, so it should compress well. And if we click on the zip, we can see that, yeah, it did. It zips down to just 16 kilobytes. So I'm just going to delete the zip file because we don't really need that. So to remount this, I can copy this over to another computer now. Just double-click it. Finder will verify it and then mount it. And now I can continue accessing this. This is a great way to archive files. It's a great way to trade a bunch of files around, especially on the internet. And again, when we're done, I'll just eject that, and I'm left with the file that I can move around or do anything I want to. So let's empty the trash, make sure there's nothing floating around in there, and pull Disk Utility back open. So I have this disk image out there. I have this My Docs volume inside of it, and I can again treat that just like a disk. I can erase it, I can do a restore, I can do first aid on it, whatever I want to do. Right-clicking it, I don't get a lot of options though because it's not a real disk, it's just a file. I do get right-click options on the volume that's inside that file, just not on that. So again, really super useful way to work with files and folders and such like that. So let's go ahead and close Disk Utility. I'm going to clean up my desktop a little bit. You can delete these DMG files just like any other file. Notice that my trash can icon did not turn into an eject icon because this is just a file. It's not the mounted version of it. So I can right-click here, empty the trash, and we're all cleaned up. Now another common way to sort of pass files around is on CDs and DVDs. And Macs actually have built-in ability to burn those types of images. So there's kind of a couple ways to do it. The easiest way to create one of these is to go back to the disk utility. So we'll go to the utilities folder, open up disk utility, and I'm going to do the same thing I did before. File, new blank disk image, only this time instead of selecting 100 megabytes, let's save this thing on the desktop. Let's just call it my image. And we are going to choose a 660 megabyte, which is a CD-ROM size. They also have presets for an 8 centimeter, the little business card size CD-ROM, as well as different DVD formats. So we'll pick a CD. Now this is automatically going to pick the right partitions we need. So now there is a partition. It's a CD or DVD partition. We'll create that. Now it's going to take it a little longer to create because it's got to set aside 660 megabytes worth of my disk space. Remember that DMG files always take up the full amount of space even if they're not full. And when it's finished, it's going to format that for me and then mount it or attach it so that I can actually treat it as an image. So we'll minimize disk utility there. I'm going to close this. Actually, I'm going to move the Finder window over a little bit and go to my documents. Here's my disk image down there, so I can drag a file to it, copy it on there. No big deal. I can get properties and so forth for this. Get info. I can see that this file is taking up indeed 600 and roughly 60 megabytes on disk. It's got a capacity of 647. I can, change its permissions and everything else. Change its name here. We'll call this my CD image. That changes it on the desktop as well. I can right-click, eject it, duplicate it, do all the normal stuff that I can do with a regular disk image. The trick is it's sort of been pre-formatted so that it looks like a CD. It's the same size as a CD. Now, one thing I didn't show you before was this Images menu. This is basically the same things that you can do when you right-click the DMG file. I can verify the image, make sure that it's all intact and that it's readable and usable. I can calculate a checksum for it, and that's a useful thing to be able to tell someone, hey, here's a disk image, and here's the checksum from when I made it. If you mount the disk image and you generate the checksum, they should match. If our checksums don't match, then it's possible that the DMG file was damaged in transit, or it was modified in transit. So if you're emailing a DMG to someone, for example, you might in a separate email send the checksum so that they can kind of double check. The other thing I can do here is convert the image. And where am I going to save the converted version? Let's just call it my image 2, save it on the desktop. Do I want to save this as a compressed image format, or, this is kind of neat, a DVD CD master? I'm not going to create any encryption on it, but I will save it. And it's creating a separate file now called a CDR file. So it's going to start by reading the original image off my disk, which is that DMG file. It's going to convert it into a different type of image, a CDR image, and save that to the desktop as well. So let's just let this go through. Now remember, we're working with a 660 megabyte file. So it's important that you have enough space on your real hard drive to store all of these images, because we're actually going to have 2 copies of it now. The original one, as well as this new one that we're creating from it. So it's almost done reading the disk image. And all saved. So we get this second one here called CDR. It's an exact copy of this one, just in a slightly different format. And when I right-click this, you can see that I have the same options to verify and so forth. Note that I don't have a burn option, though. That's because it's not an ISO or ISO image. The way you would work with those is if you have an ISO image from somewhere else, you can right-click one of those and actually burn the ISO to a real physical disk. So let me show you a little trick here. I'm going to quit Disk Utility, and I'm going to rename my CDR image and just change the CDR to ISO. I'm going to get prompted. Are you sure you want to change the extension from CDR to ISO? Yes, let's use ISO. Now, let's unmount the image so that we're just left with the file. And in fact, while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and delete that original DMG file that was out there too. So we'll delete that, empty the trash, so we're just left with that ISO file. Now remember, I started off with a DMG, created this as an ISO. So double-clicking this will still mount it. Still looks like a CD image there. And if we look on it, I still have my file on there, the list. So let's unmount that again. All right, so I'm going to go back into Disk Utility. And the only reason I really quit it before was to force it to refresh the screen. So let's go back into Disk Utility. So now you can see that the screen has just got this one. I'm going to go ahead and mount this, open the disk image. And now that this is an ISO, if my computer, which this computer does not have a CD burner, if my computer had a CD burner, I'd be able to right-click and select Burn. So that's how you can go about creating a standard ISO image, which you can share with Windows people even, put on the internet, let anyone download. It's a standard CD or DVD image format. You can burn it to a real physical plastic disk and pass that around the office too. And you do all that from within Disk Utility. So let's just do our last little bit of cleanup by ejecting that image that we mounted from Disk Utility, deleting the file, and cleaning up the trash bin. In this nugget, we've talked about disks and drive management. We talked about formatting, including things like setting up RAID, where you'd go to do that, working with first aid, which is how a Mac would try and repair a disk that's not functioning, and so forth. We've also talked about defragging, including the fact that it is not built in. You're going to have to work with a third-party utility, although at least now you know that fragmentation does occur, and you do need to worry about defragmentation from time to time, especially if your computer becomes slow over time. And finally, we looked at managing disk images, both DMG files, CDR files, and ISO files, including how to burn those ISO files to an actual physical disk if your Mac happens to have a built-in or external burner, so a CD burner or a DVD burner. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.